All right, guys. This is Falcon Central Radio, part of the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined as always by my co-host, Scott Karasik. Today, we are joined by none other than Matt Harmon of Yahoo Sports. Welcome to the show, Matt. I think we last had you on during the 2014 season, talking Carolina Panthers or something like that. But welcome back to the show. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, it's been quite a while. Thank you guys for having me on. Aaron, I think you and I talked on the Locked On Falcons show a couple months ago when I was still with NFL. So you seem to be the key here, man. Whenever I'm looking to change jobs, I hop on a show with you.
Okay. All right. Well, we talked about Calvin Ridley on that show, and I'm sure we will talk about him tonight. We do want to get your thoughts on some of the fantasy guys, specifically sort of with the Falcon-centric guide for people that, are about to start up their leagues, are going to be drafting soon, and want to get some insights into when they want to take their favorite Falcon players in their certain drafts. You know, there's a tendency among fans to sort of reach on guys just to make sure that they get their favorite Falcon player, but maybe we can throw some strategy in there so you guys can outsmart people a little bit. And of course, we'll talk about the Falcons-Jets preseason game a little bit later, as well as their upcoming matchup against the Chiefs, and answer your guys' no-bad questions. But Matt, let's jump right into it. Running back is one of the key positions in fantasy. And when it comes to Devontae Freeman and Tevin Coleman, I guess the first question I have is, how high should we feel comfortable taking Devontae Freeman this year?
Yeah, Freeman's a guy who I consistently look at kind of in that second round range. He does feel like one of the more underrated players to me this year among a running back group that's pretty popular. Obviously, people, like you said, people are targeting running backs hot and heavy this year. But the reason I like Freeman is he's pretty much got passing game and goal line work relatively secure if you go based off the history of his usage. Even though a little bit last year it did get dialed back in the pass game with Steve Sarkisian taking over. But nevertheless, among these guys that are kind of going in that second round range, he feels like a pretty safe pick. You know, he maybe doesn't have the upside of, the Jerick McKinnon or the Christian McCaffrey. And I say upside kind of like theoretical upside. Maybe he doesn't have those guys as kind of like fresh new car smell, but he's a player that I think you're hitting a double with. And so I have him in my third tier of running backs, which does contain a lot of guys that go in that late first, early second round range. So if Freeman's there kind of towards the 2-3 turn, he's definitely a guy I've been targeting.
Now, the Falcons' other running back in Tevin Coleman, he's a guy. Is he simply a guy that people should look at sort of as a spot guy? Is he maybe a potential handcuff? If you do wind up taking Devontae Freeman later, you can sort of swing back and get Tevin Coleman a little bit later. Is he maybe a guy that you might target a little bit more in PPR leagues, or is there sort of any options where you might, be willing to bet on Coleman's upside potentially?
Yeah, I typically don't like to double up on running backs, especially when you look at it as a handcuff situation, because to me, I always want to try to maximize the upside of my teams. And if you're handcuffing, you're essentially just kind of insuring one of your picks in the off chance that it fails. So to me, what I like to do is I like to take, one starting running back, and then maybe in the later rounds, I'm going to take a backup running back from somebody else's team, so that way, if that starter goes down, now I have two starting running backs as opposed to just I've insured the loss of one potentially. I think handcuffing is more of a, kind of playing for fourth place strategy. And I don't know about everybody out there, but I'm definitely not rolling to play fourth. I'm trying to get first. So to me, I don't view Coleman as a handcuff though, because he's too expensive. Typically when you're looking at handcuffs, you're thinking double-digit rounds. He's definitely a guy that you're looking to play every now and again. He's definitely super volatile because he is not the lead running back on this team. I project Freeman, to lead the team in touches. I think most people do. But Coleman is definitely a guy that you can throw out there as a bit of a spot starter. He has some standalone value. I like him on best ball leagues, which are the leagues where you're just drafting a team and you're letting it sit. You're not managing the team during the year, because he obviously has a really high ceiling. If Devonta Freeman is to ever get hurt, then he kind of inherits that workhorse role. But even in the meantime, he does offer big week potential because he's been a big play asset in the passing game. He has been used as a red zone specialist every now and again. So Coleman is a guy who is really team construction dependent. I don't want to necessarily be relying on him as a starting running back, but certainly like to have him as an upside play again in the event of a Freeman injury, and someone that every now and again I can have some home run week potential.
Which is kind of the frustrating thing about Coleman is he doesn't get the same kind of touches that you need for that home run week often enough, I feel like.
No, he's a low probability bet for sure on a week-to-week basis. But it's kind of the same situation in Tennessee with guys like Derrick Henry and Dion Lewis. The reason I do like taking one of those players is I know that I'm probably not getting somebody that I can project 20-plus touches a week for, but in the event that one of those guys does get hurt, and we know that football is a game of attrition and there's injuries all the time, and we're going to be wrong about a lot of this fantasy stuff as well. And I'm not saying that I think one of these two guys is going to bust, but again, if an injury happens to one of the Tennessee backs, one of the Atlanta backs, then you're looking at a guy who is going to inherit that workhorse role on two teams that I think are going to have good offenses this year. So that's why I do like to take them, kind of as a bet on chaos taking place, because we know it often does.
Definitely in the NFL it does.
Yeah, running back seems like has the very big potential to be boom and bust. I remember last year I took David Johnson #1, and I got burned very badly on that. When I was like, David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell, which one should I go with? I went with David Johnson. It kind of tanked my season right there.
Yeah. Nah, the injury rates at running back are super high. Among all other positions, you are more likely to select a player that's going to, get banged for a season-ending injury with the running back position. But those players like David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell, Todd Gurley now is definitely in that category. The reason we all keep trying to drink from that well is because when they are healthy and playing 16 games, they give you a clear advantage over the field. These backs like Freeman and, again, that tier of Kareem Hunt, Leonard Fournette, Melvin Gordon is in that group. Those guys are all good running backs, and they're going to be RB1s in fantasy, but they do not offer you the touches and touchdown upside of a player like Bell or David Johnson and Todd Gurley. If you don't want to go with one of those players, that's when you target a wide receiver, but you do realize that you're losing some of that maximum advantage.
Now, let's talk about Matt Ryan. And, is he a top 5 fantasy quarterback, even though Jalen Ramsey doesn't seem to think that he is a top 5 NFL quarterback?
I mean, I'm not going to say it as strong as Jalen did, but I definitely don't think he is a top 5 fantasy quarterback this year. But I do think he's an underrated fantasy quarterback for sure. The problem with quarterback is, it's just such a deep position, man. You're getting into like my 5th and 6th tier, and I'm still thinking that some of these guys can be solid starters. I have Matt Ryan in the same tier as guys like Pat Mahomes, Matthew Stafford. All of these guys are undervalued in fantasy to me. Hell, even Alex Smith I think is going to be a viable fantasy starter. The position right now is just so deep. You can just replace production so easily. It's the exact opposite of what we're talking about with the running back position, where running backs, if you nail that pick, you get a maximum advantage over the field, but it's not the same at the quarterback position, because if you just look at the 20th score at quarterback, it's much different than the 20th score at another position, and they're just much easier to find with quarterbacks. So I think Matt Ryan, though, he is a guy that fantasy drafters are underrating, because his fantasy analysis is just so reactionary to what happened last year. And it's always just based on that analysis, looking back and not looking forward. I think this offense is going to be really good this year, and that's why I like to target the Falcons. I like Matt Ryan as a guy you can take as a quarterback one, and I definitely think he has the ability to outkick his ADP right now.
Well, and it's an even number year. And I know that sounds a little bit odd to say, but Matt Ryan in even numbered years is better than Matt Ryan in odd numbered years. And it's almost not even close.
That's interesting.
Yeah, if you go back and look, like 2016, 38 touchdowns, 2015, 21. 2017, 20. 2014, 28 touchdowns. 2012, 32 touchdowns. So, he keeps getting better, and he's better in even years than he is in odd years. And it might just be that, like, he gets this thing like, oh, I'm going to do this new thing. Oh, all right. Well, the new thing kind of petered out. Well, let's do another new thing. And it just keeps going. And every second year, he does something that's completely different that keeps him not ahead of the curve, but it keeps him producing much better.
One of the most useful stats in predicting, year-to-year fluctuation in passing scoring at the quarterback position for fantasy is touchdown rate. And if you just look at Matt Ryan's last 3 years, that's been an incredible predictor of his fantasy stock. Back in 2015, he threw a 3.4% touchdown rate, which is obviously well under his career average, which right now sits at 4.6. But then, so you knew that was going to regress back to the mean. That was going to come back to more of the normal. But he actually in 2016 way outkicked that with a 7.1 touchdown rate, which obviously led the NFL during his MVP season. And most people, I think, would have accurately told you that was going to swing back towards the normal. But he once again went way below that normal to a 3.8% touchdown rate. Now, if he just even gets up to that career median, you're looking at a guy that's definitely going to be up there in the high 20s for touchdown passes. And really, that's all you're looking for out of a fantasy quarterback if they're going to outkick that, mid-teens average draft position. So that's why I like taking him. His best player, Julio Jones, who I'm sure we'll talk about, he had 3 touchdowns last year. That's definitely not going to repeat itself. So, yeah, for me, I definitely like Matt Ryan as a quarterback pick.
So it sounds like you think Julio Jones might only catch 2 touchdowns. No, I'm kidding.
He only caught 2 from Matt Ryan. That's the crazy part. He had to get a little help from his number 2 receiver.
So would you agree with me that touchdowns, more than anything else for a receiver, is the function of the offense and not really the function of the receiver's talent?
Touchdowns are just inherently very fluky statistics. They go and wave year to year. So to me, it's just they're very rare events. A great season for a wide receiver is to catch, 11 to 10 touchdowns or something like that. You're real happy with that number. But if you think over the course of the season, if a guy's targeted 160 times, you're only looking at a small percentage of plays. So whether it's by design or just by happenstance, a lot has to go right for a receiver or a running back or anybody to get in the paint. So to me, it's more so the fact that these are very fluky statistics, whether it's by design or talent, whatever. I think it's more opportunity based than anything else, and that opportunity is tough to come by.
So with Julio, he's pretty much money when it comes to catches and pretty much money when it comes to yards. It's that touchdown number that seems to be sort of the thing that sort of knocks him from being, in the conversation for being that first wide receiver drafted. Do you feel like, specifically speaking to our listener base, who certainly probably will be prone to taking Julio over guys like Odell Beckham and Antonio Brown, do you feel like that move might pay off for our listeners out there if they do decide to take Julio as their wide receiver 1?
I can't recommend anybody take receiver over Antonio Brown. I mean, the dude's just producing at a different level, 100-plus catches in 5 straight years. Really no reason to think that production is going to tally off. Again, to me, he's the best in the business. But I think Julio over Odell is definitely within the range of outcomes. I have him in the same tier with Odell Beckham, DeAndre Hopkins, and Michael Thomas is a guy I think gets up into that tier as well. But I think you can easily make the argument that Julio belongs at the second wide receiver spot. You mentioned it. Yards, consistent. Catches, consistent. Targets, consistent. It's just the touchdowns that have been volatile year to year. But again, that's this fluky statistic here and there. And not to mention, he caught 3 this year. He's not going to catch 3 again. If you just project him, and I go through and I project every single team every year. And this year, if you just project Julio Jones to finish around his career average touchdown rate, maybe give him a little bit of boost because you think Matt Ryan's going to have that boost. You get him up to the 7 touchdown range. He's easily, a top 3 receiver. What people are burned about with Julio right now is not just the touchdowns, but the fact that a lot of his production, if you look at it on a points per game basis, came in a small handful of games, and otherwise he, wasn't consistent. But consistency in fantasy is a crock. You could say that this guy's great. Like, he gets me a certain amount of points every week, but it's all about winning weeks. And Julio Jones is a week winner. And again, if he just gets from 3 to 7 to 8 touchdowns, you're looking at a guy that is much more quote unquote consistent, or has a better floor week to week.
Yeah, one of the things we say on this show is basically, if one of those games against the Bucs every year, he's going to win you the week, because that's been pretty consistently the case over the course of his career.
Or the Panthers, man, he's ripped up the Panthers the last couple of years.
I was going to say
the
that.
only one he hasn't had like a 300-yard game against in the division is the Saints.
Yeah, now he's got the battle with Marshawn Lattimore there. That's going to be a fun one to watch.
He put 120 yards on Marshawn Lattimore in each game last year, though.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's hard to slow it down a player like that for sure. But it's gonna.
Yeah.
I think it's a fun division all around, man. That's why I like taking these NFC South players, because I think a lot of these teams are good. And while I think the Saints, Falcons, Panthers all have relatively decent defenses with a few flaws and a lot of strengths, I don't know that anybody, one of them is going to be like a shutdown unit. So I really like this division a lot for fantasy, because there's just a lot of good offenses and some potential high-scoring games.
Now, you mentioned the defense. I do, before we talk about Calvin Ridley a little bit, do you want to elaborate a little bit more on, a big buzz thing in Atlanta is this defense going to take a big step? I'm wondering if, sort of from a fantasy standpoint, you feel like, they were pretty low on turnovers last year. You got to feel like that's going to, improve this year, just from statistically speaking, regressing a little bit more to the mean. But what are your thoughts maybe on some of the improvements that the Falcons defense may or may not make this year?
I like this defense a lot. A lot of the players on there are really appealing and fun to watch. The issue with the Falcons defense, and why they might always struggle to be, a consistent defense that makes big plays in terms of interceptions, sacks, whatever, is that they concede a lot of short passes. If you look just the last 3 years, they're consistently one of the teams that gives up the most catches to running backs, which, isn't a big deal for fantasy. That's great, because you can look at these guys like a Chris Thompson goes against Atlanta. You're going to want to play him there, because teams have figured it out, apparently, for them to consistently be one of these teams that finishes really high and catches allowed to running backs. But for the team, it's not that bad, because they trust guys like Devondre Campbell, Deion Jones, their safety, Keanu Neal, to come down and make those tackles and not allow big plays after the catch. So I do wonder from that, like, do we see that change this year? I don't know that I would just project it to change, because it's been this way throughout this era of the Falcons. But I do think that that's a reason why they're not going to necessarily be a big turnover team. If teams aren't looking to rifle it down the deep part of the field and are just fine conceding catches to running backs and tight ends, then they're not going to necessarily make all those big plays. But I do think this is an ascendant defense, no doubt. And a lot of guys like Deion Jones and Keanu Neal, who I'm really fond of for their play speed and the way they fly to the football.
Now, going back to the wide receiver group, Calvin Ridley, a lot of buzz with Calvin Ridley. Didn't have a great preseason debut. We'll talk about that a little bit later on the show. But sort of, how high are you on sort of Calvin Ridley sort of maybe doing what Taylor Gabriel did in this offense 2 years ago, as opposed to what Taylor Gabriel did in this offense a year ago?
Yeah, it's funny story about Taylor Gabriel. He's definitely upset about the not getting the football last year. I wrote a story for NFL.com, the top 10 available free agents or whatever, that come into this offseason. He hopped in my DMs and was like, "That's not my fault, man. I didn't make that list. I just didn't get enough touches last year or whatever." He's like, "Can't make plays if you don't get fed." And I was like, "All right, dude, nothing personal." But I don't know that I see Ridley putting up big fantasy numbers from a consistent week-to-week basis. I think that this role between him and Mohamed Sanu is really good for the Atlanta Falcons offense. I said this with you earlier in the offseason, Aaron. Like, I think this is a great position to add to the receiver corps. A guy who can play a bit of flanker, play a little bit of X, and even move into the slot. I think it's a great spot for Ridley, because of his natural separation ability, one of the better performers in success rate versus man, actually best success rate versus zone coverage I've ever charted in reception perception history among college prospects. So I do think he's going to be a really good player. My issue is just finding the volume for him to be successful in fantasy. I think maybe towards the end of the season, he starts to really push ahead of Mohamed Sanu, but he's just not the type of guy that I want to use a fantasy pick on earlier in the season while he's getting acclimated. And I'm not going to get many returns. I could be wrong. Maybe he gets off to a really hot start and commands, 90 to 100 targets, but that would really surprise me if he gets that kind of volume early on in an offense that has a center of the universe passing guy in Julio Jones, has some interesting players here and there, and also has two running backs in Freeman and Coleman that they want to get the football to.
Which makes it interesting when you've got a guy like Calvin Ridley, because I think you're going to see a little bit of time, some of the time where Julio Jones isn't on the field and Calvin Ridley and Mohamed Sanu are. So do you think that ends up giving more targets to Calvin Ridley than, say, what Taylor Gabriel was getting last year?
Yeah, potentially. And I hear your point on Julio, not being on the field, because that's one thing when you go, like I do, go in and chart every single route that they run over a certain handful of games. You do see Julio come in and off the field, and whether that's to keep him fresh, whatever, he's not like, Antonio Brown or DeAndre Hopkins, these guys that are just out there on the field all the time. And, you can argue whether that's good or bad or whatever, but it has definitely been the case over the last few seasons. So I don't know though. I'm just more of in a kind of wait and see situation with Ridley. Maybe he does get that type of usage, but to me, they're just where he goes in drafts, in the double-digit rounds. There are guys that I think have much higher ceilings within their range of outcomes than he does, even though I do think he's going to be a good pro and help this offense in year one.
Now, it's interesting when you look at a guy like Mohamed Sanu, who seems pretty consistent getting a certain number of touchdowns, but doesn't get, rack up huge yards or huge catch numbers. Is there a potential role for Mohamed Sanu? Sort of, is he like a waiver wire type of pickup, or should, anybody out there sort of, if he's there available in those last couple of rounds, maybe snag him and see what they can get out of him?
He's probably a guy that's only on the radar in super deep leagues right now. But what I will say is what I'm gonna want to watch the most throughout the rest of the preseason and even in the early regular season, because I think Ridley and Mohamed Sanu will both be kind of waiver wire pickup type guys. Maybe Ridley goes high because he's, a rookie, whatever. But nevertheless, like what I want to see early in the season, in the preseason, is where are these guys lining up? Who I would think Mohamed Sanu probably ends up taking more slot snaps than Ridley. And if that's the case, then, when you're in season and you're putting together lineups or you're playing daily fantasy, I want to know which one of these guys is a shot to see 70% of their snaps in the slot. And then you look at some teams that give up a lot of points or yards or whatever through the slot, and then you use them on a week-to-week basis. So I think that's what you're going to look at Mohamed Sanu and even Ridley for too, is these games where you're looking for a bye week filler. This guy's going to be out there getting snaps in a good offense. And, hey, they go up against this team, let's just say the Browns. They gave up a lot of production out of the slot last year. Okay, well, I'll throw him in the lineup this week, or, the Packers or whatever. Just one of these teams, just whatever, to take your pick that is weak in the slot, then that's where you want to use a guy like Sanu.
So what's interesting about that is I think the Falcons have three receivers who are good both in the slot and outside, where in the past, I don't know if they did.
Yeah.
Even under Kyle Shanahan, I don't really feel like Gabriel was really a slot receiver. He was an outside guy. I felt Sanu was more the slot receiver, and then Julio would sometimes play in the slot. So now you got three guys that can play in the slot, and I think you're going to see a lot more bunch sets too, where you're essentially having two slot guys at the same time. Do you think that really affects production overall by having so many different guys that can play in the slot?
I think it's great because, in my opinion, just doing some of the reception perception work I do, some of the work I used to do with NFL, with the next-gen stats, the player tracking data, you just get more separation. You see less press coverage. You see less tight window targets when you run routes out of the slot. So to me, and if you look at some of the work, Pro Football Focus, some of the guys there have done this. The EPA out in slot targets is much higher than targets to the outside, which, intuitively, we watch football. That makes sense because you've got smaller defenders in the slot. You're not necessarily seeing these big boundary corners that get up on these number one receivers. Teams just aren't really prepared for that. And even if you look at some of the best cornerbacks in the NFL, they don't track guys into the slot. If you watch games like when T.Y. Hilton was lining up in the slot a lot in 2016 for the Colts, he wasn't drawing, other than guys like Jalen Ramsey, some of the few players that do it, he wasn't drawing number one corners into the slot. So I think it's great for Julio's fantasy stock as well if you do see him get more burn out of the slot. If I was running an NFL team and I had a number one receiver, I would want him to get about 30-40% of their targets out of the slot because, again, they're just much more efficient, whether you look at it from a production standpoint, a separation standpoint. Those targets are just much easier to accrue. So that's a great point. If these guys are all getting work out of the middle of the field, I think that's just helpful for not just them, but for the entire offense. And, of course, all that bleeds back to Matt Ryan as well.
Yeah, it was noticeable last year with Julio is a lot of those games where he would get shadowed. They would move him into the slot because they knew teams either weren't going to move their shadow corner into the slot to follow him, or if they did, that would be not necessarily a place where those guys often thrive because most of those guys are sort of outside guys. And you saw the Falcons really make a lot of efforts last year when they did move Julio to the slot, which I think he played maybe like 20 or 25% of his snaps there, where when he was in the slot, they would purposefully target him quite a bit to try to, take advantage of all the things you just pointed out, Matt.
Yeah, Michael Thomas with the Saints is a great example of that. He's not a guy that, lines up on the slot like 50% of his time, but when he's in the slot, Drew Brees is throwing in the ball because, again, those targets are just more efficient. And it's a great point, too. Like the boundary corners, it's just an entirely different game. One of the better player conversations I've ever had was with the Rams slot cornerback, Nickel Roby-Coleman, and he was just insistent to me when we were talking about cornerback play that, like, these inside guys just don't get the respect they deserve because they've got to defend the two-way go. The outside guys, your Richard Shermans or whatever, they can constantly push, they push and press to guys to the boundary. It's a lot helpful having, this much of space here without the two-way go for the slot cornerbacks that have to defend that. It's a big, big advantage. So slot cornerbacks, definitely underrated player group in the NFL.
Now, the last Falcon player that we do want to ask you about is Austin Hooper. He's a tight end. Sort of struggled with some drops last year. Expectations are that he will hopefully fix those issues. Been working with Matt Ryan quite a bit this offseason. Is Hooper going to fall into the same trap that you mentioned before with some of these other guys like Ridley and Sanu, where there's just too many mouths to feed and maybe puts a ceiling on his potential in fantasy? Or do you feel like maybe he's a guy for the Falcons, a team that's looking to improve in the red zone, could sort of be a little bit of a breakout guy and maybe not necessarily put up huge yards and catches, but maybe pad his total a little bit in the end zone?
I definitely think that he has the issue of too many mouths to feed, too many talented players in here. Again, with a guy that Julio Jones going to command 150 plus targets, and then a lot of these other players are going to clean up in addition to passes to the backfield as well. I don't think he necessarily has the targets to be a true breakout guy, but he was somebody that I was on heavily last year as a potential breakout player. So maybe he does have a bit of post-hype sleeper appeal. But I have him in like tight end 21 range right now, well out of the range of guys that you're drafting in a typical league. But he is playing in a good offense, and with tight ends right now, it's just such a disgusting position, man. Like I put my tight end tiers out today. It's a rough position in fantasy. After the top seven guys or whatever, you're really starting to throw darts. So it wouldn't completely shock me if Hooper becomes a guy who is a reliable fantasy player because, again, it's a shallow position. I think he's a good player, or at least I thought he was coming into 2017. And if he can become that red zone threat, that's really all you're looking for at the tight end position. If you're streaming guys on a week-to-week basis, again, thinking about matchups in season beyond just doing the draft to start the year, you're going to want to throw Austin Hooper out there if he does have that touchdown potential. So he's somebody to monitor. Again, probably waiver wire guy, but not somebody I'm really drafting right now.
So yeah, I'm taking him probably 8th, 9th round just because I think he can be that starting tight end. And I think people are sleeping on him because the last time a receiver worked as hard in the offseason with Matt Ryan, the way Hooper has been doing this year, it was Tony Gonzalez. going into 2009, going into 2010, 2011. And it was a guy who was like, hey, let's get you set up. And I think Ryan's returning the favor, paying it forward, if you will, with Hooper by saying, hey, Tony did this for me, so I'm going to do this for you. Like, we're going to work. We're going to build up this chemistry that we didn't have last year. And I think it's only going to help.
Yeah, that's interesting. He's definitely, again, the type of, from a skill position perspective, like he's the type of guy you want out of a fantasy tight end because I think he can move around. He's not a traditional inline guy or whatever. So, yeah, he would be a great addition to, again, a tight end group that just sucks after the top few players. So he's somebody that I'm willing to draft in, like, again, best ball leagues that go 18-plus rounds where you're not setting a lineup every week. You're just looking to get their big weeks slotted in for you. But I hope you're right, Scott, because, again, position needs the help, man. Needs the help.
Scott is buying up all the Austin Hooper stock this season that everybody sold last year. So we'll see if it pays off for him.
Hey, I did it in 2016 with Matt Ryan, so worked out pretty well for me then. I won 4 leagues that year. To be fair, I was in 12, but still, I won 4 leagues.
All that matters is the raw numbers. Don't look at it on a percentage basis.
Yeah. Matt, is there anything else you want to add? Maybe, maybe not necessarily a Falcons-centric take, but maybe for our listeners and our viewers, maybe some sleeper help or something that you want to get out there and maybe help guys sort of win their league this year?
Sure. I mean, I've been putting out my tiered rankings on Yahoo Fantasy right now. If you just go to yahoo.com/fantasyfootball, you'll be able to find them there. I actually just tweeted out the cheat sheet as well with all of this. You can find that too. You'll see some guys I'm higher on or lower on. And I really think drafting in tiers is a great way to approach your fantasy draft because then you're not just necessarily like saying, oh, Corey Davis is wide receiver 30 and, this guy's wide receiver 32. I better take Corey Davis. Like you could really think more broadly about what you should do when you're constructing fantasy lineups. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. Doesn't end at the draft. You've got to play this team out on a week-to-week basis. You got to make decisions how to put together a lineup. I think tiered rankings really help you with that rather than just a numerical list. And if you look at mine, I think some guys that stand out that I'm higher on. Kenny Stills from the Dolphins is a player I really like this year. I've never been a big Devontae Parker fan, and this has kind of been the offseason where it seems like it's finally coming to an end in terms of him getting that annual training camp hype. He's got an injury right now too. I think Stills is the favorite to lead the Dolphins in targets, catches, yards, etc. And he's been a good player for them. Now that Jarvis Landry's gone, it takes a lot of volume with him. I think Stills is the favorite to soak that up. And he's a guy you get consistently in the 10th, 11th, 12th round. I think he might even go undrafted in some casual leagues because people don't really know about him, even though he's been around forever. So he's a guy that I really like as a sleeper. I've been picking him up a lot. And a couple of super late receivers. Michael Gallup on the Cowboys is really interesting to me. Made a big play in preseason week 1. He's someone that you can look at as a guy that was a real good player in college, man. I don't think he is Michael Crabtree, but he had some very similar traits to Crabtree coming out of Colorado State. He's in a passing game right now that has a real lack of proven players. If he's already running with the starters in preseason and catching touchdowns there, I think that's a good sign for him. He's a super late round pick you can look at there. And John Brown's another receiver. I've loved John Brown for years. I think if you deny the fact that he was on an upward trajectory before sickle cell issues, you're kind of lying to yourself. And he's been the star of Ravens camp so far too. Another guy you can consistently get in the double-digit rounds. Those are receivers that after maybe you load up on running backs early, you need some receiver help towards the end of the draft. Those are 3 guys I've been looking at for sure.
Okay. Well, Matt, you already plugged your stuff on Yahoo. Is there any other place like Twitter or anywhere else that you want to plug before we let you go?
Sure, yeah. I mean, you can follow me on Twitter at Matt Harmon _BYB. Been rocking that awful BYB for years now, but stuck with it, man. Stuck with it. And if you want to check out my work with wide receivers, just use the hashtag receptionperception on Twitter or go to receptionperception.com for more information about how you can get access to all of this unique data that I chart out that you really can't find anywhere else.
Okay. Well, Matt, we appreciate you joining the show, talking with you, giving us all this fantasy advice. We certainly can use it.
And if you ever want to join a fantasy league with me and Aaron, we will gladly create a 3rd Falcon Central Radio League and have you on it.
I got so many fantasy leagues right now. I need to start cutting out. It's like when you get too many you get too many books or DVDs or something. I got to start giving some away before I start buying some on Amazon. I got to start getting out of leagues before I get it anymore.
Fair enough.
Yeah. All right, Matt, we appreciate it, man, and look forward to talking with you throughout the season and getting some fantasy updates and whatnot.
All right, cool. Thanks, guys. Good luck to you, and good luck to everybody listening, too.
All right, guys, we will jump into preseason talk now. Appreciate Matt for joining us on the show. And we'll start off by recapping some of our observations with the Jets game. I'll be honest, Scott, I barely paid attention when the starters were in because I knew they would get pulled after that first series. So, like, if anybody has thoughts or takes on what the starters did, like, I honestly was just glazed over. And I watched the game twice, and I still was glazed over the second time. So, to me, what was more interesting was the backups and whatnot.
I don't really worry about the starters until game 3. So, I mean, we'll get a full quarter of them probably this time, but I'm still not worried about them until game 3.
Yeah, pretty much. That's how I roll as well. Let's talk a little bit about some of the players that really stood out in our eyes. You made fun of me, Scott, for talking about Kurt Benkert a week or so ago, but he sort of came in and provided a spark to the Falcons' offense. They actually got like a first down thanks to.
I don't remember his arm being that strong at Virginia.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just I watched him. Like, the only time I really watched Benkert at Virginia, he was going against guys with cannons like Watson and all of that. So comparatively, he didn't look that strong arm, but he does have a strong arm. I'm kind of shocked.
Yeah, like that was one of the questions I had of him when he was coming out was like, how strong is his arm? Because you would see throws where it's like, oh, he's got a strong arm. And then you would see throws where it would sort of wobble, like these 7-yard passes would wobble. And it's like, wait, what's going on with that? And so, yeah, he was pushing the ball down the field, made some nice plays, used his legs a little bit. So, he's a guy that is in the mix to possibly force the Falcons to keep 3 quarterbacks if he continues to play at that level. So we'll see what happens. That 4th preseason game is going to be big for him because you imagine he'll probably start most, if not all of that game and play quite a bit. So we'll see what happens with him over these next couple of weeks and then going into that last game. But some other guys that sort of stood out on the skill position players on offense, you got Malik Williams led the team in rushing. Falcons really couldn't get anything going on the ground until Malik Williams came in, sort of tag team with Benkert to get the offense a little bit of energy. We saw Devin Gray catch a couple of big plays in the second half, by and large to Benkert pushing the ball down the field. On the offensive line, Matt Gano was working with the second team at right tackle, had a pretty solid performance. I thought his pass protection was pretty good. A little wonky, a little up and down in run blocking, but that goes without saying. And, given his athleticism, his length, you want to see him excel in pass protection, and you can sort of develop the run blocking down the road, I think.
I agree. And Gano, I'm trying to not sound like I'm super high on the dude, but I am. In pass pro, he reminded me of a young Ryan Schrader with the footwork, good hand punch. Like, technique is there. Athleticism's there. He needs to get snaps. And I want to see Gano get pretty much every snap he can at right tackle. Basically, if Schrader's not on the field, I want Gano on the field. And I think they should focus on Pastor playing guard to try and earn his roster spot. Or, maybe Gano could be the swing tackle that we all wanted.
Yeah, I think right now he is – I wouldn't necessarily think he's in the mix to be the swing tackle this year with Pastor and Sambrailo competing for that spot. But I do certainly think he could be a guy that the Falcons could wind up stashing on the roster with the plan of him possibly taking over as a swing tackle next year, just because whoever wins that battle between Pastor and Sambrailo as the swing tackle, both of those guys are free agents. And so, sitting here today, you don't necessarily feel like the Falcons are going to be as sort of compelled to lock up either one of those guys beyond maybe a 1-year veteran minimum contract next offseason. So, if you have a guy like Gano waiting in the wings and with the full year of development, rather than him spending that time on the practice squad, you have a potential option there for a 2019 where you can have a guy that maybe that saves you a draft pick if you were sort of worried about Ryan Schrader getting up there in age. And if you feel like Gano could be a guy that could sort of be, a new Ryan Schrader as an undrafted free agent that turns into a starter down the road, that's one less draft pick that you have to use, particularly when it comes to offensive tackles, where if you want anybody that has anything close to starting potential, you kind of have to use a top 3 pick on that guy because they pretty much, the premium at the position, pretty much you might get a couple of guys sort of sprinkled in the 4th round. But like for the most part, like if you're not using the top 80, top 90 pick on the tackle, they're all gone by the time you get to round 4 and certainly round 5. And we saw that in the past with Lamar Holmes and whatnot. So it's one of those things where, if Gano can be a future starter, developmental starter, that's a day 1, day 2 pick that you're potentially saving the Falcons from having to make over the next 2 or so years. On the defensive side of the ball, we got much more better performances overall than we did on offense. Who basically, it wasn't really until the second half where we saw anything happening on offense. But defense, we saw some promising play. Deidrin Senat stood out. Foye Olakun was another rookie that stood out. DeMonte Casey was probably the MVP of the game, had a really strong performance, was basically all over the field, playing slot corner, playing single high, playing in the box, thumping guys, lowering his helmet a little bit sometimes and getting some flags. So that's something that the Falcons are going to have to work on cleaning up. But, it's a teaching moment, so we'll take it. And, Scott, what were some of your thoughts on some of the defensive standouts?
Sanat looked ready like day 1. He was just owning that interior. He looked like he should have been playing one technique in college. I think if Sanat would have played one technique in college for a different school, he probably would have gone a lot higher than he did. He was just looking really good in that game. Oluokun surprised me. He was getting perfect depth on his zones. For me, linebackers, you have to watch what they do when the ball's not going their way just as much as what they're doing when the ball is going their way. So where Duke Riley was having issues with depth and trying to find the ball in coverage, Oluokun was reading the play, seeing where the open man was, figuring out, hey, I've got to go help out over here. There was a play where he didn't make the tackle. He didn't make the catch. He didn't do anything but drop back in his zone. And then he realized that Justin Bethel was going to be the one getting attacked. And he kind of slid off into his zone to kind of cheat towards Justin Bethel's area because he realized, hey, this is where I need to be more because this is who they're attacking. He's got the coverage skills of a safety. And at linebacker, that's what you need. And he's going to be a very good linebacker in the NFL once he gets that time to develop fully. But I'm impressed with what I've seen from Oluokun. He did get washed out a little bit in the run game, but outside of that, I think he could be more ready than Duke Riley is at this point for real game action, which if you would have asked me probably 3 weeks ago, I would have never said that. But just my impressions against second stringers from, probably one of the worst teams in the league. I'm definitely thinking it's Oluokun.
Yeah, I mean, Duke Riley certainly made waves on last Friday with sort of his subpar performance, and sort of one of the knocks I sort of said about him was that he seemed to, his instincts were questionable. He seemed to be playing a little bit robotically, and I think the difference between him and Oluokun was playing sort of that fast and loose style that you want to see. And it certainly was an eye-opener for me as well, because I also was one of these people that was not particularly high on Oluokun's chances of really doing much of anything on defense this year. I thought he was basically just going to play special teams, largely due to the whole transitioning from a safety to a linebacker and making that jump from the Ivy League to the NFL. I figured it would take him at least a year to sort of make that transition. But again, based off of his first performance, he certainly looks to be a lot ahead of schedule. And certainly in contrast to Duke Riley, who, relatively looks to be a little bit behind schedule. I think the thing the thing I said on Twitter last week that I'll say here is I do think Duke still needs reps. He basically played less than half a season last year, and so I think he needs to continue to get reps, and we'll hopefully see progress as he grows more reps. It'll be interesting to sort of see what Oluokun does the rest of the preseason, because I would imagine, based just purely off of what happened last season, if the Falcons sort of look at Duke Riley and say, okay, he's not necessarily ready to be that starter on the weak side when we go play base defense, that they would probably more likely go and plug in Kamal Ishmael, just because he was able to start, those 6 or so games and played reasonably well. But if Oluokun continues to progress, and like you said, Scott, because he has that coverage ability that Ishmael doesn't really have, and is one of the reasons why he's a linebacker and not a safety anymore, then the Falcons can sort of play with that a little bit, and maybe Oluokun could be potentially ready to make some make an impact in week 1. So we'll have to see how it plays out. You got any thoughts on Duke Riley other than what you said?
I don't know. I don't know what is going through his mind right now. I don't know if he is just overwhelmed with what's going on with the transition from college to the pros. I feel like with Deion Jones, we saw flashes his rookie season. We saw coverage ability. We saw at least the hint of instincts. We didn't really see that much with Duke Riley, but it was like, all right, well, he's still a rookie. At least there's other people around the league, other people on the team that have had that situation. Riley looked a lot more like Devondre Campbell his rookie season, where Campbell was kind of lost, if we're being honest here. Jones was showing out, hey, I've got this ability. I can do this. Campbell was like, all right, I'm out here, but I'm learning by fire. It's trial by fire. Second year, Campbell got it all together. And you could see it in the preseason that he kind of figured it out and was like, all right, this is my role on the team. I don't see that with Duke Riley. I see a guy who was lost a little bit last year, and I see a guy who's even more lost this year. I don't see a guy who's going to be an NFL starting linebacker at this point. And I hope he proves me wrong. I hope he improves, and I hope he does better. But right now, Oluokun's outplaying Riley. And I don't think that's unfair to say. I don't think that's wrong to say. And I hope Riley gets it together and, shows he's the guy that he was in college, which was a really good linebacker. Maybe a little overdrafted because I had him as a mid-third, but Atlanta took him at about 72-ish. So it was right in that same kind of range. But, I don't know what's going on with him. He looked good in college. He was playing fast, loose, good, right kind of player. Looked like a Falcons kind of player in college. And then I don't know what happened. I couldn't tell you what happened.
Well, I think some of the things you said, and look, I'll be a little bit, I'll play devil's advocate, or I'll defend Duke Riley in this sense, is I think you mentioned a thing that I think is sort of hurting Duke Riley, because his career path at LSU was pretty much identical to what Deion Jones's was, which was he was a backup for 3 years and a 1-year starter. And because Deion Jones was able to come in and be successful, the expectation is that Duke Riley will be the same. And I think clearly at this point, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. And I guess where I would differ from you, Scott, is I feel like he just hasn't played really enough to really be able to determine whether or not he does have a future as a starter. I mean, you look at a player like, say, Stephen Nicholas, who was basically a special teams guy for his first 2 years in Atlanta and then wound up starting, 4 or 5 years after that point. And, again, you might want Duke Riley to wound up being a better player than Stephen Nicholas, which I think he still has the potential to be. But I guess the point is, he can still salvage this. And I think, we're going to find out over these next couple of games in the preseason and then again during the regular season, sort of what progress he shows. And I think instead of sort of focusing on where he is right now, I think now we have to just basically see if he can get a full year on the team and not have to deal with the injury bug, and see where he is by the end of the year, which, may or may not be significantly improved from where he is right now. And I think, it's hurting him, I think, in terms of a lot of people's perspectives, is that they sort of look at him and it's like, why isn't he Deion Jones? Why isn't he doing what Devondre Campbell is doing? And I think, again, it goes back to not having the same amount of reps that those guys had. He had the same amount of reps that Deion Jones had in his first 5 games as a rookie. He had the same amount of reps, that Devondre Campbell had in his first 5 games. So from one perspective, you can look at it like Duke Riley has only played enough to be like halfway through his rookie season. And so we just need to see a little bit more. And maybe he gets there, maybe he doesn't, but I think only time will tell. And I think we have to be a little bit more patient than we have grown accustomed to being with some of these young defensive players like a DeMonte Casey, like a Deion Jones, like a Grady Jarrett. And he just may be one of those guys that's a little bit slower to pick it up than some of these other guys.
Well, you mentioned Grady Jarrett. Grady Jarrett is a guy who had a bad first year. He had limited snaps, and he wasn't great his first year. Second year, he developed. He kind of showed out, looked a lot better, but still wasn't the Pro Bowler that he should have been last year. And then last year, he was giving out Pro Bowl performances left and right.
Yeah. I'm not going to sit here and say and I'm not suggesting that you were saying it either. I'm not going to sit here and say that Duke Riley's got Pro Bowl potential, but I think he can still be at least a solid sort of starter down the road, potentially still. And, given his athleticism, I still think he can have a role in this defense, but we just have to wait and see. And so, with that being said, he's going to be one of those guys that certainly people are going to be heavily focused coming up this week against the Chiefs, which will be the Falcons' preseason home opener. We know that the Chiefs are going to play their starting offense for the entire first half. So we'll get the opportunity to see Duke Riley go against some starting caliber players as well as some other players. The expectation is the Falcons will probably do what you said earlier, Scott, maybe play their starters a couple of series, maybe play them a full first quarter, which typically is like 3 series or whatever. So probably not going to see those guys playing deep into the second quarter. But, Riley is one of those guys I want to see step up. I want to see more of Calvin Ridley. I want to see more of Ito Smith. Ito Smith only got 2 touches last week. I want to see him basically get like all the first half touches if possible. I know Devontae and Tevin will get some reps, but basically after that point, I just want Ito Smith to be on the field every snap. And I want to see them, design some stuff for Calvin Ridley beyond, one measly screen pass on that opening series. So,
I mean, yeah, you got to give Calvin Ridley like a legit route, like a slant route. It's not like he's going against these great corners in Kansas City.
Yeah, especially their best corner is Fuller, and he's their slot guy. So
Fuller, maybe Steven Nelson, maybe. I mean, their corners kind of blow. So I mean,
Nelson's terrible.
I mean, I'm not gonna sound arrogant here by saying that he played better corners at Alabama when he was at Alabama, but he kind of did.
Yeah, Fuller's good. Nelson's not good, and pretty much everybody not named Marcus Peters for the Chiefs last year at cornerback was not good. So I don't expect that to change unless they picked up somebody else other than Fuller that I don't remember.
I mean, just looking at the guys he played in college, he went against Jair Alexander. Oh, yeah, not Jair Alexander. Never mind. He went against Dante Jackson, Carlton Davis. In practice, he'd go against Anthony Averett. Like, he played legitimately decent cornerbacks. Tony Brown, he played in practice. He went against Tolliver. Like, I'm not really afraid of Ridley going against Steven Nelson.
Yeah, David Amerson is their third corner. So, yeah, not particularly good there for the Chiefs.
Yeah, not really worried about Amerson. when he's blown past better cornerbacks.
Yeah, I think Ridley, depending on how much work they get, Ridley, Emerson, Ridley is basically the perfect type of receiver that usually gives Emerson a lot of trouble. So that's a matchup potentially to watch.
Ridley gave Kevin King and Sidney Jones issues in the playoff game when they played 2 years back. He destroyed Cam Sutton pretty much every time they played. Like, I'm not afraid of these guys when Steven Nelson isn't as good as Cam Sutton was in college. Neither one of those guys are as good as King or Jones were in college. Like, I'm not afraid of Nelson or Kendall Fuller or Tremont Smith if I'm Calvin Ridley.
Yeah. Anybody else that you're sort of focused on? I know, some of the guys that we talked about that stood out last week, like Gano and others, you want to see them continue to play well. Anybody else that sort of caught your eye that you want to see you're going to be focused on against this Chiefs team?
I'm going to watch a lot more Sanat. I'm going to watch a lot more Aluakun because I think with Travis Kelce, with that offensive line that they have there where they've got Tardif and Morse and Schwartz on that right side, Fisher's not great, but he's not terrible either on the left side. So, I mean, they've got some decent players in Kansas City. They've got a decent offensive line. They've got a good running game. They've got a good running back. I want to see how the starting front seven really plays against the run, how they guard Travis Kelce, how they handle the receivers with Watkins and Hill, just kind of throwing everything in there together.
Yeah, I want to see Oliver go up against guys like Watkins and Hill. I want to see how he matches up with those guys. I think one of the question marks you had about Oliver coming out was, does he have that sort of deep speed where, like, particularly a guy like Tyreek Hill, well, almost no one has the speed to match up with Tyreek Hill. That's why he's Tyreek Hill. But Watkins is also a vertical threat, and so you want to see sort of if he does get one-on-one opportunities with those guys, sort of how he handles those, and that's going to tell you a lot sort of, in terms of what sort of matchups. Is he going to be more of a pure size guy against the, we may not see Alshon Jeffrey week one, but those types of guys, the Mike Evans, the Michael Thomases, or can he be able to hold his own this year with some of these faster guys that are a little bit more of the sort of speed guys? And so that'll be an interesting matchup, especially with the Chiefs' first team offense playing the entire first half. So we should get to see some of those matchups.
It'll be fun.
All right. Let's move on and talk about the mailbag. We got a couple of questions. Slim Gator at South Life Gold. Do you think Duke makes the 53-man roster? LOL. Okay, but seriously, could you see Dan Quinn starting Foye over Duke week one if he shows out and Duke doesn't improve much more? I think Duke will bounce back, but I'm still interested.
If Duke doesn't bounce back and Foye Aluakun continues to progress, he could easily start. I could easily see Foye starting over Duke, and Duke being that fourth linebacker and special teams guy, and maybe he's a nickel linebacker when they run that 3-3-5 setup with Devondre Campbell in on the field. But I'm not thinking Duke gets cut. But I could also, I mean, it's very, very easy to see where a guy like Foye Aluakun could end up starting. Like, when I first watched him play in college, like his college ball, I was like, this guy's like Ike Reese. This guy's like today's Malcolm Smith, not Super Bowl MVP Malcolm Smith, but like that fourth linebacker that every team needs, that solid special teamer. Like, that's what I was thinking you'd have with him. But I mean, I don't know. It could be an interesting situation where Duke ends up on the bench.
Yeah, I think it will be interesting to see how it plays out. I think sitting here today, as I said earlier, I feel like if Duke is not the starter week one, I think it would be more likely that they go with Kamal Ishmael. But again, that's saying not knowing what Foye does the next couple of games. That's not knowing what Duke does the next couple of games. That's not knowing what Kamal Ishmael does. Like Kamal Ishmael is a known commodity, but as I said before, like he's not really a guy that you want out there on passing downs, and he does somewhat limit your ability. Like you're not going to play man coverage when he's out there on the field. You're going to be basically that cover 3 zone, which the Falcons are more than happy being, but they do like to mix in their man coverage quite a bit. And that's the difference between what Duke brings and what Foye brings, is much more akin to what you see with Deion Jones and Devondre Campbell, who are really good in man coverage. So I think we'll have to see how it plays out. But sitting here, again, if you asked me a week ago, and I think someone did ask us this question about like Duke Riley struggling or whatever, and we were like, where are you hearing this? But, it seemed to come to fruition. But, yeah, a week ago, if you had asked me what are the chances that Foye Olakun starts week 1, I would have said 0 or maybe like 0.1 or something like that. But now I would probably bump that up to maybe like 20%. And then if he plays well again this week and Duke struggles again, then, that number will continue to creep up. And then by the time we get to week 1, it might be 100%. So I think that's going to be the thing to watch over the preseason. This was a position battle that I don't think anybody really thought going into the preseason was going to be a position battle, but now it has basically become one. Lee at Fan since 1988. Have you guys heard anything about this new strategist hire from West Point? Is he going to be the Falcons' Ernie Adams? I haven't heard anything.
I have no idea what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And I've been looking since I saw that question at the beginning of the show to try and find anything on this, and I have no idea what this dude's talking about.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, let's say maybe, because I don't know what you're talking about. So maybe. We got some questions from Evan Birchfield. Evan's first question is, which Falcons rookie / undrafted rookie stood out most to you in the Jets game?
Ooh. Okay. Rookie Foye Oluokun and Deidre are not tied there because they both looked really good. Just watching Oluokun off ball, watching Oluokun on ball. There were times when you'd see DeMonte Casey come in for a hit, and then in the film you'd be like, oh man, Oluokun was right there. To where you were like, if Casey misses this tackle, Oluokun's there to clean it up. So I was really impressed with that. And then Sanat was just destroying the interior. Undrafted rookie, Gono. Like by far it was Matt Gono. That dude was playing really well in pass pro, and you didn't really notice him in run blocking, which is kind of a good thing. If I had to throw anybody else out there, it's Bird. Bird was running great routes. Even when he wasn't targeted, he was out there getting open. He was, beating his man. I want to see him get more time with the 2s, with the 1s, because he was killing it with the 3s.
Yeah, just to pick some different guys, I will go with the undrafted rookie. I will go with John Cunningham. If any of you guys were still awake in the fourth quarter, I thought Cunningham was basically being Deidre Sanat light in the fourth quarter and basically was dominating, the Jets' third string offensive line, which you want to see from some of these undrafted rookies. It's usually a sign that guy can play, is worth developing. I'll cheat. He's not technically a rookie, but he was undrafted. I'll say Ricky Ortiz. We got to do our weekly fullback update on the show. And I thought in limited snaps, Ricky Ortiz showed something as a fullback. We'll see if he can sort of continue that this week. Trying to think, was there anybody else that we didn't talk about earlier that stood out to me? No, that's about it. I mean, Jonathan Celestin. He came in late and made some plays. Anthony Wimbush. I thought Wimbush played pretty well as well.
Zimmer was underrated too because he was playing that one technique.
Zimmer played well too.
And Sanat. And when you were like, I was like, yeah, I could see Zimmer making the roster over, Garrison Smith and Tuoti Mariner and JT Jones and like all the other linemen that aren't named, that aren't the main contract guys. You were like, yeah, okay, whatever. because we were talking about that first depth chart, and I'm like, no, I think Zimmer could do it. Good athlete. Like, worst case scenario, I think Zimmer's on the practice squad with his performance last week. I think that's going to be his track as a worst case. He was really good. He was eating doubles. He was destroying them off the ball, doing everything you want a guy who's a one technique to do, which is eat a double every play.
No, yeah, I don't agree that I was that down on Zimmer as you made it sound like, Scott. But yeah, I think he did play well. I think the competition at D tackle, at least based off of one game, is probably the thickest because you had Zimmer showed out. I think Cunningham showed out. We saw some flashes from Garrison Smith as well. And so, it seemed like as you said,
Crawford
like
had flashes. Crawford had flashes. Jared had flashes. Sanat had flashes. I think the only guy that didn't truly flash was McLean.
Yeah, but McLean, Crawford, Sanat, Jared, those guys are locks to make the team. Yeah. So those are those contract guys. But I do think, the battle, as you said, with you sort of are thinking Justin Zimmer could be that guy. But if the Falcons do keep a fifth sort of D tackle, I think this is going to be a fun competition to keep an eye on as the preseason goes, because I think at this point it could be really anybody's game. I think Cunningham did some things. I think Zimmer did some things. I think Smith did some things. So this could be one of those battles that really does come down to that last preseason game where basically the guy who gets the most tackles for loss in that game is the guy that winds up winning the job, just because it could be a pretty hotly contested position group. Evan's next question is, has there been a modern MVP who is less nationally respected than Matt Ryan?
I can't think of one. Not one that's actually earned respect, I should say.
I have to look up all the MVPs just to be sure. Off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure, yes, it is Matt Ryan.
Yeah.
Unless, the only person I would say that comes close is Cam, but I don't feel like Cam. I feel like it's mostly Falcon fans that disrespect Cam and not necessarily national media guys. But
like maybe Rich Gannon in 2002 is like the closest.
Yeah, I feel like Sean Alexander is, in retrospect, doesn't get as much love.
That was a hell of a year, though.
Yeah, it really was. So it's like, I think, when you look at some of the running backs that have won the MVP, like, he's probably the least respected, but I don't think it's really,
right.
So Matt Ryan definitely
27 touchdowns. That's a sick year for a running back.
Yeah, they rode Sean Alexander all the way to the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
So it's not as if like he was playing bad. But yeah, I would probably say Matt Ryan, at least in terms of certain things that I know that people weren't happy with sort of where he was ranked on the top 100 after his MVP season, which I know was like the lowest of anybody that won the MVP the previous year. So I guess if, that's probably where you rest your case.
You probably haven't seen any MVP since maybe 1982 when Mark Mosley, a kicker, won it. Get the same kind of response. And I think Cam and Matt Ryan are kind of on the same page as MVPs, where they just had sick years and then they have like a bad year or two afterwards. And it's just like, all right, well, what are we supposed to do here? How are we really supposed to judge this player who just had the best year of his life and now he had a bad year? It's all about regression to the mean.
Yeah. Evan asks, are there any specific players that you'll be watching closely in the Chiefs game? Anything you want to add that you didn't already mention now, Scott?
Not really. I can't think of anyone super specifically. Maybe Ito Smith, maybe Malik Williams. I don't think that the offensive line, though, is giving these guys the holes to really be judged, and I don't think that they will until later on.
Yeah, it's probably going to be the fourth preseason game when they're going up against other scrubs where we might see those holes start to open up.
Which is how it works every year.
Pretty much. Especially last year. The running game was just non-existent once the starters came out last year. So I think they're a little bit better than they were last year because they were just terrible, but it's not good. And Evan's last question is, I think we answered this, but is there a position battle at weak side linebacker?
Yes. And if there's not, there should be, because Duke Riley is not ready. It's honestly at a point where I don't know if Duke Riley is a weak side linebacker in this scheme anymore with how I was watching him the other day. I almost wonder if he's a true strong side linebacker. Like, that's kind of where I'm at because he just looked lost. And yeah, I know Foye was playing middle, but middle's a harder position than weak side. It's not an easier position, especially in this scheme. Like, you got to have a very large football IQ to be great at middle linebacker in this scheme. That's why Deion Jones does so well. That's why Foye looked good, because he has a high football IQ. I didn't realize it as much because he was playing at Yale, going against Ivy League dudes. I mean, there's not as much talent in the Ivies, but he's showing out right now. He's looking a lot better than Duke is. He's looking like he understands the game a whole lot better than Duke does. When you look at him on his keys and on his reads, he's doing what he's supposed to, which, if that's all you get out of Foye Oluokun, that's all you need. Even if he doesn't flash to be a great player, if he's just like Stephen Nicholas, like if that is his ceiling and that is what he ends up becoming, Atlanta fans will love him. Because Stephen Nicholas was a good linebacker. He wasn't the best linebacker. He wasn't a Pro Bowl linebacker, but he was an above average NFL linebacker who gave the Falcons, I want to say, 5 or 6 good years of weak side linebacker play right in the middle of their run from 08 to 2012, when they were going to the playoffs every year and made it to the NFC title game. So I think that's what you're going to get out of him. I don't know what his ceiling is, though. I'm being honest with you. I thought his ceiling was Ike Reese, and now I'm getting proved wrong after one preseason game. So,
yeah, we'll see what Oluokun does this week, and if there's be a weak position battle. Well, guys, that is it for our show. Again, we want to appreciate Matt Harmon, who we had on earlier to talk fantasy stuff. Apologize to South Life Gold. He asked a fantasy-specific question that I overlooked. Maybe you can tweet it at Matt and see what his answer is on that. I think it was something to do with Kerryon Johnson or something. But if you guys want to send in your mailbag questions, you can use the hashtag Falcons Mailbag. I am on Twitter at FalcFans. Scott is at Karasik S. You can tweet at the show, which is Falcons PFC. You can find all the links to our iTunes feed at profootballcentral.com. Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon on the Pro Football Central YouTube page, as well as might as well go ahead and subscribe to Scott's and my YouTube page for nights like tonight where we are not on the main page, and as well as check us out on Facebook at Falcons Central Radio, and give us a like while you're there as well. So, yeah, that's it, guys. We'll be back next week to talk about this Chiefs game. We'll be back to talk more trash about Jalen Ramsey next week and gearing up for that Jaguars game that's now got a completely different tone than it would have had, a little bit more exciting for a third preseason game. So we'll probably be back next Tuesday night unless something comes up, back to our regularly scheduled program. But, yeah, we'll talk to you guys then and, rise up.